At my son's high school graduation, my parents announced they were taking over his college fund for my nephew. My husband laughed and said, "That's funny because we moved it last month." My parents screamed when they realized. High school graduation, my parents announced they were taking over his college fund for my nephew instead. My husband laughed and said, "That's funny because we moved it last month." My parents started screaming when they realized. I still remember the moment everything shattered. The night should have been a celebration. My son Ethan had worked his butt off for years, nailing AP classes, balancing part-time jobs, juggling extracurriculars, and finally, after all that hard work, he'd been accepted into his dream college. The whole family had come together to celebrate. At least, that's what I thought. We'd chosen a nice steakhouse for dinner. Something special. Even though my parents and I had never seen eye to eye, I needed them there. I wanted them to share in this milestone for Ethan. But my parents, they had other plans. As the waiter set our drinks on the table, my mom picked up her glass with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, clinked it with a fork, and then stood up. The room went quiet. The air thickened. She cleared her throat dramatically, looked around, and then said it. The words that cut through the evening like a knife. "We've decided to take Ethan's college fund and give it to his cousin Jason instead. He needs it more." Silence. I froze, my heart racing. Ethan's face turned ghostly pale, his eyes flicking to mine. My husband, Mark, tightened his grip on his fork. And my younger daughter, she stared at us, not understanding why the tension was suffocating the room. My dad nodded like this was perfectly fine. "It's what's best for the family," he added, as if that somehow justified everything. "Jason's had a rough time, and this will really help him get his life back on track." Jason, my nephew, the kid my parents had always chosen over my kids, the one they'd bailed out of trouble time and time again, the one who never faced consequences. And suddenly, here we were at my son's graduation dinner, being told that his future, the future he had worked so hard for, was being handed to the kid who didn't deserve it. The heat in my face was rising. All those years of swallowing my frustration, of letting my parents dismiss my kids in favor of my brother's family, it all boiled over in that moment. But before I could say anything, Mark leaned back in his chair, took a sip of his beer, and of course, he had the perfect response. A low, almost amused chuckle escaped his lips, and he said, "That's funny because we moved it last month." Everything stopped. My mother blinked. My dad's smile wavered. "What?" she demanded, her voice cold as ice. Mark's grin didn't falter. "Yeah, we saw this coming. So we moved Ethan's college fund out of your reach weeks ago. And that's when the storm hit." My mother's face went redder than I thought humanly possible. She stood up so fast. I thought she might pass out from the anger. "You had no right," she screamed. My dad slammed his hand on the table so hard, silverware rattled. "You can't do that." His voice was louder now. "That money was meant for family." Finally, I found my voice. And with it, everything I had been holding back exploded. "Ethan is family, and that fund was his. You have no say in this. You're being selfish." My mom sneered. "Jason needs this more. You know how hard things have been for your brother. We're fixing it for him, and you are ruining it." And just like that, I knew they had never, ever planned for that money to go to Ethan. It had been a game to them, waiting for the right moment to swoop in and take what wasn't theirs. To take what was meant for my son, and give it to the kid who'd never earned it. I looked at Ethan, and I swear it was like watching his soul shatter before my eyes. He had always known, deep down, that his grandparents didn't favor him. But this was different. This was the cold, hard truth. They didn't care about him, and that broke something deep inside me. I turned back to my parents, my voice shaking with fury. "Oh, you mean the way you fixed things the last time Jason stole from us? Or when he got arrested and you paid off his charges? Or when he wrecked my brother's car and you bought him a new one?" My dad growled like an animal backed into a corner. "That's not the same thing. Jason's been struggling. Your brother's a single father. He's doing his best, and I'm a mother doing mine." I didn't let him finish. "And you just told my son, on one of the most important days of his life, that his future doesn't matter. That you were stealing his chance at a better life." My mom rolled her eyes like I was some kind of joke. "Oh please, Ethan can just take out loans like everyone else." That was it. The final straw. Ethan stood up so fast, the chair scraped across the floor, loud enough to snap everyone's attention back to him. His voice wavered, but there was a strength in it that broke through the chaos. "You know what? I don't need anything from you. I don't need your money. And I definitely don't need you in my life." Mark stood too, putting a steady hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Let him go," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We don't owe them another second of our time." And with that, we were done. I stood as if to confirm what I already knew in my heart. This family, these people had crossed a line, and nothing would ever be the same again. "This was your last chance," I told my parents. "You've shown us who you are over and over again. But today, you made sure we'll never forget it." And with that, we walked out. The air was thick, and as we stepped out of that restaurant, I could hear my parents screaming after us, calling us ungrateful, accusing us of tearing the family apart. Their voices pierced the silence of the parking lot, but I didn't care. I didn't look back. My eyes, though, they were on my son. I looked at Ethan as he walked beside me, his head held high despite the storm of emotion I could see behind his eyes. This was the moment I knew we had done the right thing. He was my son, and I wasn't going to let anyone take his future from him. But what I didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was how far my parents would go to try to get that money back. At first, it was just phone calls, endless voicemails, each one angrier than the last. My mom was furious, screaming about how we had betrayed the family. My dad? His messages were colder, but laced with threats. "You'll regret this." He'd growl, the words like daggers through the phone. And then 2 days later, my brother finally texted me. He'd stayed out of the argument that night, but now he had a word of advice. "Jason needs that money more than Ethan. You're being selfish." That was it. No questions, no attempt to understand. Just selfish. I didn't even bother to reply. But this was just the beginning. The real trouble came a week later, and I'll never forget the call that changed everything. Mark was in the kitchen when the phone rang. I was washing dishes when I heard him say, "Excuse me, what withdrawal?" My stomach dropped. I froze. A cold wave of panic hit me. I couldn't even breathe. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. The conversation lasted a few more minutes, but when Mark hung up, I could see it, the tightness in his jaw, the anger building beneath his skin. "They tried to access Ethan's fund," he said, his voice tight with rage. My heart pounded in my chest. "Who? Your parents? They called the bank pretending to be us," Mark explained. "Said we'd given them permission for an emergency withdrawal." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Did they know?" Mark interrupted, his face hardening. "The bank flagged it. They said something felt off and called me first." I felt a sick rush of fury. The audacity. How dare they? I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed my phone, found my dad's number, and hit call. When he picked up, I wasted no time. "You actually tried to steal from us?" I said, voice shaking with rage. "What is wrong with you?" My dad didn't even flinch. He didn't sound guilty at all. In fact, he sounded defensive. "You left us no choice," he replied, his tone casual, like this was all perfectly reasonable. "We wouldn't have had to do that if you weren't being so unreasonable." Unreasonable. I could feel my blood boiling. Unreasonable. They tried to commit fraud. It was our money. I snapped back. "It's our money. You didn't put a dime into it." My dad's voice turned icy. "You think you did all of this on your own? You think we never put anything in that fund?" That stopped me cold. My mom cut in then, her voice sharp like a knife. "You're remembering wrong," she said smoothly. "And if we were to bring this to court, I guarantee they'd agree we have a right to it." My blood ran cold. A right to it? I could feel my hands ball into fists, shaking with the weight of it all. "You're threatening us with a lawsuit?" Mark must have seen the panic in my eyes because he stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "They wouldn't win. They don't have a leg to stand on." But as I stood there staring at the phone, I wasn't so sure. My parents were master manipulators. They'd always twisted the truth until they turned themselves into victims. And if they were willing to go this far, what else were they capable of? 3 days later, we got our answer. I was pulling into our driveway when I saw it. the thick envelope sitting on our doorstep. My stomach sank. I picked it up, and as soon as I saw the return address, I felt that familiar, sickening churn in my gut. It was from a lawyer. I ran inside, my hands trembling, and tore it open. Mark was in the living room, flipping through a magazine when I walked in. "What's that?" he asked casually. I scanned the first page, then the second. By the third page, I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper steady. "They're suing us," I whispered, my voice barely a breath. Mark's head snapped up. "What?" "They're claiming they co-funded Ethan's college savings," I said, my voice shrill now. "They're saying we transferred the money illegally without their consent. They're claiming they own part of the fund." Mark snatched the papers from my hand, his eyes narrowing as he read through them. "This is complete bullsh," he muttered, throwing the papers back on the table. But I wasn't so sure because my parents, they were good at one thing: lying, twisting reality until they made themselves the victims. And in a legal battle, if it came to that, they might just have a chance. In the days that followed, we scrambled. We dug through every single record we had. Bank statements, transfer receipts, every deposit we had ever made into that account. I wouldn't let them take what was rightfully Ethan's, not without a fight. The bombshell dropped at the next lawyer meeting. My parents, those smug, self-righteous people, produced a receipt from over a decade ago, a single deposit, $2,000. That's right. They sat there with the kind of smug grin that makes your blood boil, and their lawyer argued that because they had contributed anything to the fund, they now had a right to control its future. $2,000, I repeated, the words tasting like acid in my mouth. "You think that gives you control over the entire fund?" My mom just smiled sweetly, like she was delivering the most reasonable statement in the world. "It was a contribution, and without it, you wouldn't have had the foundation to save as much as you did." Foundation? The red mist descended. I could feel the heat rise in my chest as the anger swelled up from deep within. Thankfully, Mark was cooler-headed. He sat there taking a slow breath before calmly cutting through their absurdity. "So, let me get this straight," he said. "You think that just because you gave a one-time gift over a decade ago, you now get to decide where this money goes?" My dad, in all his arrogance, nodded. "Exactly." I wanted to scream, to tear that courtroom apart with the truth. They had no right, but they weren't stopping there. Not by a long shot. It took weeks, but eventually the court ruled. My parents had no claim over Ethan's fund. Victory? Sort of. They couldn't touch the money. But the worst part, the message was loud and clear. My parents were willing to do anything at all, to punish us for standing up for Ethan. And they were just getting started. 2 weeks after the court ruling, Mark came home one night, his face so pale it looked like he'd seen a ghost. "They reported us," he said, his voice strained. I blinked, not understanding. "What?" "To the IRS," he added. "They're claiming we committed tax fraud." My world stopped. The moment he spoke those words, the air went thin. I couldn't breathe. The weight of what he was saying settled over me, cold and suffocating. My parents had reported us for hiding money. They'd told the IRS we were misreporting our funds, funneling money in ways that weren't above board. "This is insane," I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Mark nodded grimly. "Yeah. And now we're under investigation." That was the breaking point. I thought the lawsuit was the worst it could get. Losing a chunk of money? The betrayal stung, but nothing could prepare me for this. When the IRS showed up on our doorstep, that's when I knew. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was war. My parents weren't trying to steal Ethan's college fund. They were trying to ruin us. And if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one. The investigation began with a letter, a cold, formal notice. A piece of paper that seemed to drain every ounce of heat from my body. "Your finances are under review," it said, due to a report of suspected tax discrepancies. Mark was the first to read it. I saw his face blanch as he exhaled sharply and handed it to me without a word. My hands were shaking as I scanned it. "This can't be real," I whispered, barely able to keep my voice steady. "Oh, it's real," Mark muttered under his breath, his eyes hardening. And then came the phone call. A polite but firm IRS agent on the other end, explaining that an anonymous tip had flagged us for hidden assets and fraudulent fund transfers. We both knew exactly who was behind this, but proving it, that was another story entirely. For the next few weeks, we were buried in paperwork, bank statements, tax records, anything and everything we could find to clear our names. But as we dug deeper, the stakes kept rising. The worst part? Ethan's financial aid was affected. His scholarship was temporarily put on hold because of the IRS review. My parents weren't just after Ethan's college fund, they were after his future. And that was my breaking point. If they wanted war, I was about to bring them hell. I started digging. I knew my parents. I knew their secrets. They'd spent years bending the truth, twisting stories, manipulating people to get their way. They had always played dirty. Well, now it was my turn. It didn't take long to find something big. My parents always acted like they were the picture of responsibility, the financial backbone of the family. But what they didn't know was that years ago, Mark had helped them set up a small rental property investment. He'd handled all the paperwork, the tax filings, everything. And guess what? They'd been underreporting their rental income for years. They thought they were invincible, but they had been sloppy. And I had found their weakness. I wasn't going to report them directly, at least not yet. I was going to make them feel it first. I was going to hit them where it hurt. Their pride. I dialed my mother's number. She picked up on the second ring, her voice dripping with smugness. "Oh, so you're finally ready to apologize?" I almost laughed at the absurdity. "No," I said, my voice cold. "I'm calling to let you know that I found the real tax fraud in this family." There was a long silence. Then came the scoff. "What are you talking about?" "Your rental income," I said, letting the words hang in the air. "The money you've been hiding for the last 15 years? I could almost hear her breath hitch on the other end. She was panicking. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I do," I replied, my voice as sharp as ice. "And so does the IRS, or at least they will, unless you drop this and call off the dogs." I could practically feel the blood drain from her face even over the phone. Her tone shifted instantly. "You wouldn't." I smiled, a slow, dark grin creeping across my face. "Try me." She didn't say another word. The line went dead. 2 days later we got the call from the IRS. Our case was suddenly, mysteriously no longer a priority. The wheels of bureaucracy turned faster than I expected. A week after that, Ethan's college fund was unfrozen. For a brief moment, I thought we had won. They had backed off for now, but I knew them. I knew they wouldn't stop, and I was right. The home intrusion happened late at night. Mark and I were asleep when a sudden crash, glass shattering, ripped us from our dreams. For a split second, I thought I was still asleep, but then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps moving through our house. Mark was already up, moving quickly, grabbing the baseball bat he kept next to the bed. Without a word, he motioned for me to call 911. My hands shook so violently I could barely unlock my phone. Then we heard it, a voice distorted with panic. "Mom? Dad? Ethan?" A sickening wave of dread crashed over me. It was Ethan. He was awake. He had heard the noise, and instead of staying put, he was coming downstairs. "Stay in your room," Mark shouted. But it was too late. We stepped into the hallway just as Ethan reached the top of the stairs. And that's when we saw him. Jason, drunk, eyes wild and desperate, holding a crowbar. For a moment, everything stopped. No one moved. Then Jason took a shaky step forward. His breath slurred with rage. "Where is it?" he demanded. Mark tightened his grip on the bat. "Where's what?" "The money." Jason's voice cracked. "I deserve it. They promised it to me." It hit me like a punch to the gut. They sent him. My parents knew they couldn't touch the money legally, knew they had lost, so they sent their precious grandson to do their dirty work, to play the role of the victim, the pawn, the one who would deserve the money if they could only claim it through brute force. Jason staggered toward us, raising the crowbar, his movements slow and uncoordinated. "You think you can just take what's mine?" He slurred, his voice thick with entitlement. That's when Ethan moved. He stepped forward, his fists clenched, his jaw set with an unspoken determination. "It was never yours," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes, "and you need to get out." Jason laughed. A low, bitter sound that made my blood run cold. "Oh, yeah? What are you gonna do about it?" That was the moment. Mark didn't hesitate. He swung the bat not at Jason, but hard into the wall beside him. The sound of wood cracking against plaster was enough to break Jason out of his drunken stupor. His eyes widened in shock, the crowbar lowering slightly as the reality of what was happening sank in. Without another word, he turned. He bolted for the door, disappearing into the night. The police arrived 10 minutes later. Jason was arrested for attempted burglary, but of course my parents weren't going to let him face the consequences. They bailed him out before the sun even came up, and then my mom had the audacity to call me. "You've gone too far," she hissed into the phone. "You had him arrested." I almost laughed. "He broke into our home with a weapon. Your son, your responsibility," but I didn't say that. Instead, I held the line. "You're the one who sent him." There was a long, suffocating silence on the other end. Finally, my mom's voice was barely a whisper. "You'll regret this." For the first time, I truly believed her. She wasn't just talking about a little family drama. No, this wasn't over. And it wasn't going to end well. 2 weeks later, the family gathering that was supposed to bring resolution instead became a war zone. My brother reached out asking to meet. "It's gone too far," he said, his voice sounding utterly defeated. "Mom and Dad are a mess. Jason's a mess. We need to talk." I almost hung up. After everything that had happened, now he wanted to talk? After he sat back and watched our parents try to steal from Ethan, manipulating him like a pawn, I wanted to hang up, walk away, and never look back. But Mark convinced me to give it a shot. Maybe, just maybe, this was our chance to get some real answers. So against every instinct I had, I agreed. The meeting was set for Sunday at my parents' house. It felt like stepping into a battlefield. We arrived first. Ethan refused to come. "I'm done with them," he said simply. I didn't blame him. His absence spoke volumes. My parents were already there, sitting stiffly on the couch. My mother's face was drawn, her lips pressed into a tight line. My father wouldn't even look at her. Then my brother walked in with Jason. I tensed immediately. Jason looked awful, gaunt. His usual cocky arrogance replaced with something fragile, something broken. His eyes were wide and wild, as though the world had become too heavy for him to bear. My mom gestured for us to sit, but I stayed standing. "Let's get this over with," I said, my voice cold and unyielding. My brother sighed, rubbing his temples as if he were already exhausted. "Look, we all screwed up." Mark scoffed, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Screwed up? I didn't mean it like that," my brother said quickly, trying to backpedal. "What I meant is, this isn't what Mom and Dad wanted." I let out a bitter laugh. "Really? They wanted to steal from my son? They wanted to use Jason to break into our house? Please tell me, what exactly is it that they didn't want?" That was when Jason spoke, his voice hoarse and broken. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," he muttered. I thought it was mine." His words made my stomach churn. "You thought it was yours?" I repeated, the venom in my voice barely contained. "Was it?" Jason swallowed hard, glancing nervously at my mother. And that's when I saw it. The guilt that my mother couldn't hide. I turned to her, the realization hitting me like a lightning bolt. "Oh my God," I whispered. "You told him, didn't you?" My mother flinched, her eyes darting away from mine. I turned back to Jason, my heart pounding in my chest. "You lied to him. You told him it was already his, didn't you? That Ethan's fund wasn't just something that could be given to him, that it was his all along." Jason's face turned even paler as he looked back and forth between my mother and me. My mom opened her mouth to speak, but I beat her to it. "They told you, didn't they?" I pressed. "That Ethan's fund was always meant to be yours. That it was yours before Ethan even had a chance to touch it." Jason's eyes darted around the room, his guilt now plastered across his face. That's when my mother snapped, her voice harsh and defensive. "We had to," she said. Her words clipped. "He was struggling. Your brother was struggling. We had to give him hope." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, you lied to him?" I spat. "You told him that his entire future was secured by money that was never his? You took that hope and turned it into a lie?" That was when my father finally spoke, his voice cold and sharp. "What does it matter?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "You had plenty. You and Mark had good jobs, a house, a stable life. Jason had nothing. What kind of sister are you to just sit by while your nephew suffered? Something inside me snapped. I took a step forward, my hands shaking with rage. My voice was a low hiss as I forced the words out. What kind of parents are you? I demanded. You have 2 children, but you've spent your entire lives treating me like a second-class citizen while he, I pointed at my brother whose face had gone pale under my glare, got everything handed to him. And now you expect me to just give away my son's future because of your guilt? My mother shot to her feet, her face flushed with anger. But I wasn't backing down now. We did what we had to do. No. I spat, my voice low, trembling with rage. You did what you always do. You chose my brother over me. And this time you got caught. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Jason, his face ashen and trembling, looked like he had just woken up from a nightmare he couldn't escape. He shook his head, muttering under his breath. You lied to me. His eyes locked onto my mom's like he was seeing her for the first time. Jason's voice cracked barely above a whisper. You promised me. You told me I didn't have to worry about college, that I was set. You swore it was all taken care of. His breath hitched in his chest, his fragile facade crumbling. He turned to my father, and the silence from him spoke louder than any words could. Jason's voice broke again, sharper this time. You knew this whole time. The guilt in my father's eyes was unmistakable, but it didn't matter anymore. Jason let out a hollow laugh, bitter and hollow, his eyes wide with disbelief. Then his gaze shifted to me. And for the first time, I saw it. The deep, aching realization of what he had been dragged into, of what he had allowed himself to believe. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice so small, so fragile. I could barely hear him over the deafening silence in the room. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. My heart twisted. Not with pity, but with something more complex, more sorrowful. He was no longer my enemy. He wasn't the villain of this story. He was a victim, just as we had been. But it was too late. Jason didn't wait for my answer. His eyes glazed over, full of shame. And with a quick turn, he walked out the door. No words, no excuses. Just regret. The kind that hits you after it's too late to change anything. My parents, of course, couldn't accept it. They ranted. They yelled. They threw their tired, overused accusations. You're overreacting. You're tearing the family apart. They always played the victim, and it was exhausting. But this time, I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I simply said, we're done. And I meant it. This time, I meant it with every ounce of strength I had. Mark, my ever-steady partner, sat back. He didn't argue either. The fight, the battle we'd been enduring for months, was finally over, but I knew the war would still be felt deep in my bones. My brother reached out to apologize once, admitted that he had allowed things to go too far, that he had blindly believed our parents for far too long. But it wasn't enough. It was too little, too late. The damage had been done. Jason? He stayed out of trouble after that. It was almost like he snapped out of a trance. He took on a job. He enrolled in community college. He was trying, and I wanted to believe that guilt, shame, or maybe even a touch of genuine self-realization had pushed him to change. Maybe he learned something that day, but I knew one thing for sure. My son, Ethan, was no longer the pawn in this game. Ethan went to college. His college, the one he earned. My parents didn't see a single cent of that money, not a dime. They never saw us again either. There were times in the quiet of my nights when the weight of cutting off your own parents felt like a phantom limb, a grief for the dead, the kind that leaves a gaping hole in your chest. I couldn't deny that there was pain. It wasn't easy. It wasn't just about the money, and it never had been. But sometimes, the hardest thing you can do is walk away from the people who should have loved you unconditionally, no matter how deeply they fail you. But sometimes, it's better to bury the past than to let it keep poisoning your future. So, I buried it. I chose to live.
After listening to today's story, perhaps it has raised some new questions in your mind, or maybe it has brought back some old memories. Every day on Reddit, new experiences and moments create fresh stories, and they connect all of us. Everyone has their own unique journey in life, and we all try to understand the world in our own way. These kinds of moments remind us that we are all human, sometimes happy, sometimes sad, and always learning something new. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share it with your friends. Your thoughts and feedback are always valuable to us, as they motivate us to create even better content. Every story has its own unique angle, and our goal is to understand everyone's perspective and make our content diverse and relatable. Stories like these help us realize that life's journey is different for everyone, and by hearing other stories, we learn something new. You can also share your own stories with us. Your experiences are valuable to us as well, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave your feedback. We aim to create content that brightens your mind and gives you new ideas every time. If you've already seen this video before, your feedback is still important. With every piece of feedback, we can improve our content and bring a new perspective to our viewers. Today, what we saw was just a small part of the many stories shared on Reddit and across the world. It's a reminder of how we all try to understand life by sharing our experiences with each other. This video was only an example of how we try to connect with others through storytelling, learning about different sides of life. We hope to continue sharing such stories that help us all learn and grow together. Thank you for your time, and don't forget to keep an eye out for more stories coming soon. If you haven't already, please like and follow for more amazing content. Your support keeps us going, and we will strive to bring you more thought-provoking and heartwarming stories. Until next time, take care and stay curious. **